My Methodist minister thing just comes right out there. Good evening. I'm Melanie Benjamin. I'm the executive director here at the Center at Belvedere, and it's my very, very great honor to welcome you to the Medicine and Society Talk, the Reinvention of Old Age. As a nonprofit, the Center's mission is to create healthy aging opportunities for individuals who are 50 years of age and better through social engagement, physical well-being, civic involvement, creativity, and lifelong learning like this evening's program. Show of hands, how many of you, this is your first visit to the Center at Belvedere? Welcome all. Really appreciate you making the time. If you are interested in learning more about the over 170 weekly programs here at the Center that support your resilience, your sense of purpose, your lifestyle, please check out the welcome desk. They would be happy to give you more information. One of the most exciting ways the Center supports healthy aging is through partnerships with community leaders like the University of Virginia's School of Medicine, specifically our friend Justin Mutter. Dr. Mutters is section head of the geriatric medicine, is a faculty member of the Center for Health and Humanities Ethics, a division of General Geriatric Hospital and Palliative Care Medicine at the Department of Medicine. We are so grateful for this opportunity to partner with experts like Dr. Mutter and Dr. Chappel. Dr. Mutter, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Let's see if I can get this oriented. There we go. Still going well in the back, hearing well? Good, excellent. Well, welcome again, everyone. Really delighted to see everybody here. Just so everybody in the live audience here in the room knows, there's also a Zoom going on at the same time. So welcome to our friends on Zoom, of whom I'm sure there are many. And we are really delighted to be able to bring this program to you tonight, and thanks for spending your evening with us. As Melanie said, my name is Justin Mutter. I'm the director of the UVA Medical Center Hour, which is a program of our Center for Health, Humanities, and Ethics at UVA. I'm also director of geriatrics, and it's really special today to be able to bring you this event, which is really a three-party collaboration between UVA Geriatrics, the Center for Health, Humanities, and Ethics, and the Center at Belvedere. I want to thank the center and its extraordinary team for hosting us all tonight in this great, wonderful space, especially but not limited to Melanie and Virginia, Olivia and Danielle. I also want to give effusive thanks to both Charlene Kaufman, who is in the back, who is our administrator for the Medical Center Hour, and also to Professor Abby Pfeiffer Mandel, who is a visiting scholar of aging and entrepreneurship, all the way from the University of Southern California. And really, without Charlene and Abby, this event would not be possible. One final and also very important thank you to Gloria Pippin, who goes by Gigi, who is with us in the audience tonight. Tonight's conversation is made possible by a generous donation from the Pippin family in honor of the late Don Pippin, who was a real pillar of the UVA community for many years. And Gigi, thank you for believing in the importance of these conversations, for helping us bring together many communities and constituencies across our region to talk about the past, the present, and the future of aging. So thank you. Just a really brief word about our process for this evening. For those of you who are healthcare providers in our audience, tonight's event is fully accredited to provide continuing education credit for your participation. So those on Zoom have slides they can see with instructions of how to claim that credit, but if you're in the live audience, there are some handouts in the back with instructions about how to claim that credit. And the code, which I am required to say, is 24171. That's 24171. That's the code for continuing education credit. After our distinguished speakers' remarks, we will have time for Q&A and discussion with a focus on the audience here in the room. Our friends on Zoom will not be able to ask questions, unfortunately, but I'm sure there will be lots to talk about. So please just use the microphone provided to you. We'll have some roving microphones, and just raise your hand. We'll bring that to you. So on to the real event. Aging happens to all of us, everywhere, all the time. But what does it mean to age in modern America? How have we come to think of aging in ways that are different from previous generations, decades or even a century ago? We would all likely agree that with aging comes many joys and gifts, but also with many challenges and losses. What are the historical sources of those joys and those challenges? And how might we have a better understanding of that history of aging, which can help better shape our present and our future? Tonight, we're fortunate to be joined by distinguished historian James Chappel, whose extraordinary new book, Golden Years: How Americans Invented and Reinvented Old Age, explores these questions in detail. And as the book was just released a couple of days ago, quite literally, we are lucky to be the very first stop in what I'm sure will be a very fruitful book tour for Professor Chappel. He is the Gilhuly Family Associate Professor of History at Duke University, where he has taught and published extensively on the intellectual, cultural, and religious history of modern Europe and the United States. Professor Chappel writes not just for an academic audience, but for the public at large, having published essays in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Boston Review, and many other outlets. He has even written an essay entitled The Uses of History for Life, which is probably a fitting shorthand for what we hope to accomplish in our discussion with him tonight. So please join me in welcoming Professor James Chappel to our conversation.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I asked Dr. Mutter earlier, what is the list of people I should thank? And he said, I'll take care of that, which he did. But I would like to redouble everything that he said, because it's been such a warm welcome here, and it's such a wonderful community that he has set up for these very important questions. Yes, I'm in a stage of life where I have little children, and so this is a short book tour of 2 stops. So I won't be giving the talk as many times as you might think. But, okay, so I'll begin. So we live in turbulent times. We've just lived through a shattering moment in American political history. Charlottesville has found itself front and center of some of this in surprising ways. But one thing I want to tell you as a historian is that we always live in turbulent times. I don't think there's ever such a thing as normal times. We often want to get back, we live in, our times are too upsetting and unsettling. I want to get back to normal times. I don't believe in that distinction. Times that seemed normal and peaceful to someone like me, very much not so for everyone. So one of the jobs of the historian is to look beyond the headlines and beyond all the ways that times are abnormal and ask the question, from the perspective of the long term, really zooming out, what is going on here? For example, people who were alive in 16th century Germany would have said, well, the most important thing happening in my life is that my kids were called up to some confusing war, and this made it very hard to run my farm. We look back centuries later and say, well, actually the thing you were living through, we call the Reformation. And it was hugely important in all these ways that are invisible to you. So I want to start my remarks today with an experiment about what would it look like to imagine our own lifetimes in that way? Or even the lifetime of ourselves and parents and grandparents. What are we going to see when we zoom out? Everyone will answer this question differently, and there are plenty of good answers, but here's what I think. I think historians of the future, if there are any historians left in the future, are going to look at 2 things. First, they'll say, in the 20th century, we decided to industrialize the world by digging up all the carbon and burning it. This will be the century that made the world hot. And second, in the 20th century, the average lifespan shot up all over the world and basically doubled. The very nature of human existence changed. The shape and duration of the human life, the stuff that history is made of, changed fundamentally in the 20th century. So my book's an attempt to think about this latter change, about which surprisingly little has been written. I decided to write it because a few years ago I was turning 40, my parents were turning 70, and I was feeling a little frustrated. It felt like previous parts of my life were pretty well mapped out. I understood as a kid what my youth was for. I was supposed to go to school. I was supposed to learn. I was supposed to have my first kiss. I was supposed to find a passion. I was supposed to do all these different things. And then I got older, and I understood what middle age was for. I was supposed to have kids and get married and get an air fryer. And now, not everybody does those things, and not everyone should do those things, with the exception of the air fryer. But there was a cultural script. There was a set of norms that people could choose to depart from or not. But getting older, I felt didn't have that. What was I supposed to do? What were my parents supposed to do? How are we supposed to spend the great gift of years that progress had given us? Were we just supposed to extend middle age until our health gave out, or something different? And if not that, then what? And there are lots of ways to answer this question. One could answer it with philosophy or literature or geriatrics, or there's many ways to answer this question. But I'm a historian, and so I went about it historically. And so the book tries to explain how American society has answered that question over the years, and why it can seem like we don't have a great answer right now. It was a hard book to write because old age in America is enormously diverse. It would be, I don't want to say easy, but it would have been easier to write a book about the development of Social Security and Medicare, for example. This would have been a story about white guys in DC having hearings and writing bills. And that's important, and it's in the book. But that's not what aging in America is. Aging in America is black and white and Hispanic and indigenous. It's able-bodied people playing tennis, and it's people with disabilities trying to put together a care team. So in the book, I've tried to bring together as many stories as I could while keeping the book to a manageable length. I don't know if I succeeded or not. If you want to find out, it'll be for purchase back there, right when I'm done. Now, this is a long book, and it says a lot of things, but in my short time today, I want to do two of them. First, I want to give you a broad overview of the book's structure and argument. And second, I will read a few pages so you can get a sense of the kinds of sources that historians work with when we think about the history of aging. So the book starts about a century ago. It has 3 parts, and it's organized around the shifting terminology we use to refer to the older population in America. Each part tries to bring together some stories of actual people, along with social movements, cultural developments, and of course, the development or stagnation of public policy. So part 1 is about the period from 1900 to 1940 or so. In this period, older people were known as, quote, the aged, or maybe the aged and infirm. This is the first time that people realized, whoa, there are a lot of older people around, and a lot of them seem to be impoverished and unemployed. This is a problem. No one said this in the 19th century. This is a 20th century phenomenon. And so the first time that America really develops a cultural script around the older people, it's a negative and stigmatizing one. Because that was the whole point. Reformers are trying to say, these people need help. So if you have a bunch of stories about vibrant older people working in factories and playing baseball, it does not bolster your case about the need for social reform. So a whole public culture is created of miserable, impoverished, and disabled older people. And this helps authorize the creation of Social Security in 1935. And you really can't overestimate how important this was. This is the first time that Americans as a whole could legitimately expect a few years of income after leaving the labor force at the end of their life. And I do want to emphasize that. It's always been true that some people retired You can find accounts of retirement in the Roman Republic. But the idea that retirement or even old age is a stage of life that most people can inhabit, that there is a time when you leave the labor force, that is very much a 20th century phenomenon. So I tell that story about the birth of Social Security and what makes retirement possible for Americans. But I also talk about a big problem from this period. Because policymakers, then as now, were not concerned about all older people. They were concerned at this time with the white working class. They based pensions on previous income levels, and they provided them only in certain sectors of the economy. The whole system favored the privileged and the employed, and it privileged men. And you may know something about this. But the kind of discovery, at least for me it was a discovery, is that even at the time, there were other options on the table. Because I'd always heard, like, oh, Social Security, it privileges white working class people. And I thought, well, it was 100 years ago. Like, what do you expect? But actually, there were other options on the table even then. And the one I spent a lot of time on was a vibrant movement for pensions for the formerly enslaved population of the United States. It was led by an older woman from Tennessee, a washerwoman, and it was a model, I think, of intersectional old age activism. They wanted old age pensions to be a kind of reparations. They wanted them to go especially to formerly enslaved people, men and women alike. Now, this movement was suppressed, and its leaders are put in jail, right? This is Jim Crow America. And I think, in some ways, it's the great path not taken in the history of aging, because if it had been more successful, it could be that we would have been thinking about old age policy from the beginning as something that's about race and justice and inequity. But this is not what happened. Social Security is organized very differently. If you think about how Social Security works, it's not trying to redress injustices of working life. It's trying to reproduce them. Because the more money you make, the more you get in Social Security. And if you make no money, you get very little Social Security. And this is what made Social Security popular and successful, but it's also, in hindsight, quite a large deficit too. That's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is about the 1940s to the 1970s. In this period, nobody's talking much about the aged anymore. The new term of art, and one that still exists in some pockets today, is the senior citizen. I think we mainly associate that now with certain kinds of senior citizens discounts, but it was at the time polls showed it was what older people preferred to be called, instead of the aged or instead of what we have now of older people or older adults. Senior citizens was the preferred nomenclature. How come? Well, I think we have to remember what was happening in America in this period. Much of post-war history, as we know, is about previously marginalized groups claiming the rights of citizenship. This is the civil rights movement. This is the feminist movement. What are these movements about? They're about saying we too deserve to claim the full rights of American citizenship. We too deserve dignity and independence and justice. And I think something similar happens with older people. Older people, after World War II, the economy is booming. Things are moving fast. Older people don't just want to be spared from poverty. That's what Social Security did. They want to live lives of dignity and meaning and independence. They wanted citizenship. They wanted senior citizenship. And they get it. At least many of them do. This is the era when you get senior centers and retirement communities. This is the era when a whole ideology of retirement is born. The birth of the idea that retirement is a noble phase of life with its own activities. That to be in the 65-plus age bracket you do particular things, you do particular service projects. It's a dignified part of the standard human life. And people really are retiring. So Social Security passes in 1935, but of course, if you think about how it's financed, people don't start claiming benefits in 1936, right? It takes a while for it to kick off. And so it's really not till the 1950s that you see millions of Americans retiring. And there's a new policy innovation too. So just as the aged were helped by Social Security in the 1930s, senior citizens were helped by Medicare. in the 1960s. Because what is Medicare designed to do? Social Security is designed to keep you out of poverty. Medicare is meant to keep you active and healthy. It belongs in this kind of post-war ideology of senior citizenship. It is, in fact, an amendment to Social Security, and as you all know, it provides certain kinds of acute care to the 65-plus population. Like Social Security before it, it is a wonderful program, but like Social Security before it, it also has its limits. Now, when it comes to race, Medicare was actually pretty good. Medicare led to the integration of Southern hospitals because you had to be integrated to receive this really torrent of federal dollars. The issue here is with disability. Now, just as with Social Security, there was a more equitable, just solution on the table that was not chosen. The same is true in this period. Medicare could have made long-term care into a social right, as it did for acute care. And there are people that are calling for that. But it didn't. For a number of reasons. It was viewed as too expensive. But even more than that, it's because policymakers at the time are not thinking about the frail elderly. If you look at the hearings, they aren't thinking about the 85-plus population. They're thinking about 65 to 75-year-olds in the needs that they have. So as most people in this room know, long-term care did not become a federally administered benefit. It became part of something you paid for yourself or through a state-administered welfare program. And one of the real lessons of American history is that once you call something a welfare program and you devolve it to the states, that is a way to stigmatize it. And that's a way to prepare it for budget cuts. So that's the first two parts of the book. That brings us to about the 1970s. The third part about the book is about the origins of the world we live in now. One where you don't hear too much talk about the aged, and even the idea of senior citizen feels a little old and stodgy. We're now in the era of older people. So this phrase that we hear now, like older people, older adults, that has a history. It starts to be used in the 1980s. And it's different than the other two categories, right? It's fuzzy. The early categories were meant to apply to those 65 and up. Once you hit 65, you inhabited a new phase of life. You were aged or you were a senior citizen. Older people is not like that. I mean, grammatically, it can refer to anyone because everyone is older than someone, as my 8-year-old son often reminds his 6-year-old sister. And it really applies in practice to people 55 and up or even 50 and up. The great symbol of this shift is the AARP, which emerges in this period as the biggest old age organization in U.S. history. At its origins, the AARP, of course, is the American Association of Retired Persons. As you might know, in the 90s, it drops those words, and now it doesn't stand for, AARP does not stand for anything, technically, because they didn't want to be restricted to retired persons. They wanted to be a kind of lifestyle organization for those 55 and up. So let me read a little bit about this new world. I'll just read for a few minutes, and then I'll finish up my talk to get to the Q&A. So this is chapter 8 of the book. It's called Aging Bodies, Golden Girls. I have a chapter in the book about, largely about the Golden Girls, which I think is a really smart, let's say, distillation of what's happening to older people in the 1980s. Okay, so I'll read a little bit. In the late 1960s, civic agencies began to host competitive events for senior citizens that they called, tongue firmly in cheek, the Senior Olympics. In those early days, the events focused on ceramics demonstrations, cooking classes, and wheelchair rallies, not exactly the stuff of Olympic glory, and more in keeping with the kinds of sedate activities that were recommended to senior citizens after World War II. Over time, as the AARP began its rise and the ideology of the senior citizen declined, the event started to evolve. In 1980, Atlanta hosted its 5th annual Senior Olympics. Still a public affair, it was put on by a community action agency that had been founded as part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in 1965. It was, though, better publicized and more athletic than its predecessors. Senior runners carried a torch to the Civic Center, kicking off a day of sporting events for Atlantans over 60, including a marathon walk, relay races, softball and football throwing contests, a dance competition, and something I would have paid to see, an obstacle course. Over the course of the 1980s, the Senior Olympics truly entered AARP Nation. They went national, they went corporate, and they opened themselves to participants 55 and over. The energy came from two St. Louis businessmen, one a real estate developer and the other a medical products manufacturer. Perhaps inspired by the success of the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, they hatched a plan the following year to host a national version of the Senior Olympics in St. Louis. They secured dozens of private sponsors, from airlines to department stores. Just 2 years later, the inaugural National Games were held at the site of the 1904 St. Louis Olympics. More than 100,000 athletes competed in preliminary events in their hometowns, and 3,000 of them traveled to St. Louis to compete. When the athletes arrived, they were given a program that featured an advertisement for the AARP on the inside cover, and a welcome note from President Ronald Reagan himself, congratulating the participants for committing to, quote, personal fitness and a, quote, healthy lifestyle. 2 years later, another and even larger Senior Olympics was held, again in St. Louis. With photographers from Sports Illustrated looking on, the attendees prepared, as one of them put it, to, quote, kick some butt. It was a colorful event and a heartwarming one. A blind woman swam while her seeing-eye dog, Teddy, cheered her on. A 75-year-old nun wearing her black veil and a t-shirt that said "The Flying Nun" came in 6th in the 1,500-meter race walk. And some of the sexual tension of the traditional Olympic Village could be found at the Senior Olympics as well. An 86-year-old competitor confided, "I've never seen such good-looking butts and legs in my life." The games were big business. The 1989 event, Advertising Age reported, was, quote, a gold medal event for advertisers targeting the mature market. 6 companies, including Pfizer, paid $250,000 apiece to be official sponsors. In supermarkets across America, shoppers strolled by boxes of bran flakes that were loudly promoting the Senior Olympics. And you might recall the logo. It was I actually remember it from being small, that like silver fox that was on all of the cereal boxes. And then I go on to talk about how the Senior Olympics develops and how it participates in a new culture of old age healthcare, which is really emphasizing fitness and also especially self-care. So if the ideology of the 60s and 70s has been about Medicare and about doctors' care, in the 80s and 90s, we're now in a period of medical austerity, and the message now is take care of your own fitness. You might have noted that Reagan quote. He was saying, "You're taking care of yourselves, good job." Okay, so in this world of Senior Olympics and the Golden Girls and fitness programs, nobody wants to be, quote, retired anymore. The old age movement changes. It used to be a movement for benefits for those aged 65 and up. Now it's more about private sector and lifestyle solutions for those 55 and up, and this is symbolized by the new hegemony of the AARP. The point is no longer to define old age and fill up that time period with positive content. It's rather to deny old age and act young for as long as you can. So the feeling that I began this talk with and that led me to write the book, I was able to historicize. Right, I feel that way because I live in a particular moment. Again, the real problem with this, and it is great in many ways, but the problem is that it's often exclusionary in terms of race, class, sexuality, and disability. The last chapter of the book is about what happens to the long-term care sector in this period. And this is the first time in American history where everybody knew this was a big problem. Like, that was one of the surprising facts to me. Up until the 1980s, no one is really talking about the issue of long-term care. There are lots of reasons. One is that there aren't that many people over 85. That's the real huge shift demographically. Another, I think, equally important reason is that the middle-aged women who provide that care are not yet in the workforce. And now, in the 1980s, a 48-year-old woman is probably working. And so when her parents or her in-laws get sick or need care, it produces a problem in a way that it had not before. So we knew it was a problem. There are multiple options on the table, and the policy solution we chose, and it was a choice and it is a policy, was to rely almost exclusively on the unpaid care labor of family members. Now, why did we do that? Here's one place where I think historical lens can be really useful, because it really matters when a historical problem is addressed. It matters what else is going on in this period and how people are thinking about problems in that era. So you may have noticed in the earlier sections of the talk an awful lot of political energy around older people in old age. Social Security and Medicare are very expensive, as you know. And they pass in just a couple of decades, right? And that's just two things. There's lots of new other programs that are being generated for older people. Lots of programs and lots of money. Why? Well, between the 1930s and the 1960s, there is a presumption that the American government is the solution to social problems. And so when they're confronting the problem of 65 to 75-year-olds in that period, vast government programs emerge as the solution. But when it comes to the old, or the fourth age, or the 85-plus population, that problem is addressed in a different era. It is addressed in the 1980s. And this is a different period. As you may have noticed, if you have looked at the news at all in the last 45 years, we no longer live in this era of government is the solution. So when American society tries to resolve this 80-plus problem, we're no longer thinking about big new government programs. The energy is not there. So what we see are individual solutions, like fitness programs, and private sector solutions, like assisted living facilities. So that's the book, basically. That's basically the book. That's where it ends. And I realize it can sound, even as I was speaking, I realize it sounds a little pessimistic, but I do not mean it that way. In fact, I really do think that compared to other problems, and there are many problems that American society has failed to address, I think with old age, it does a reasonably good job. I mean, look at a place like this one. I was walking around earlier. I mean, this is amazing. And this is a product of history. I was reading some this afternoon about the history of this place, and it belongs in the story I just told. It has its origins in the 1960s with a senior center run by the Junior League. Junior League is running senior centers all over the country in the 1960s, in Durham too. And then it grows and it emerges and it evolves and it becomes this. This is a historical product. And there's versions of this everywhere, all over the country. So a lot of amazing things have happened, but I think that in some very important sectors, progress has also slowed down in recent years. And I think there's a lot of work left to do. So in closing, and I really want to hear what you all have to say about this or questions you might have, I do want to ask a question about the role and value of history. Because to state the obvious, most people who work on aging are not historians. Most of them are clinicians or social workers or something like this. And of course, that's where the most important work is happening. I'm glad I wrote this book. I don't think there needs to be that many historians of aging. But I do also think that history can be really illuminating, and I want to leave you with two kind of lessons, at least that I took away from my own research. One is that the problem of aging will only, I guess it's three. One is that you know this already. Aging is a massive social issue in the 21st century. We are about to cross a milestone where we'll have more people over 65 than under 18. And I think that we are in the midst of a social and political delusion that we are still in a nation of younger people. That's no longer true. We are in a nation of older people, and if the 21st century is going to be a humane century for those older people, of which I will soon be one, and it looks like there are at least a few in this room now, it will require, so I would just say that is a major problem for 21st century America. So the question is, where will the solution come from? One of the lessons of the history is that this problem will not be resolved unless the federal government gets involved in a major new way. And that's not even the right word. I should not say gets involved. The federal government is already deeply involved in what it is to be old. The whole story I just told is structured by federal programs, both what's great about aging in America and also what's not great about aging in America. So it needs to become involved in a new way. We need a moonshot for the 21st century, and private sector initiative is not going to cut it, not even county or state level or voluntary nonprofit initiative. All that stuff is wonderful and amazing. It's a necessary part of a solution, but it cannot be the whole thing. Major change will require federal investment, and we should not kid ourselves about this. The state is the name we give to organized social power. And unless the state is involved in this problem much more aggressively than it is now, I don't think we are going to see the progress we want. The other thing I'll say is that I think this is genuinely possible. Because another thing that history can tell us is that it can move fast. It can often feel stagnant, but it is not. In 1915, let's go back 110 years, Now, in 1915, nobody cared about aging. There was no such thing as gerontology. There was no such thing as geriatrics. There was no pension movement. There were no nursing homes. There was nothing. What you had was older people working themselves till they died on farms, and if they couldn't do that, they would go to an almshouse. That's what there was. 20 years later, the passage of Social Security. 25 more years, you've got a whole vast network of things. You've got nursing homes, senior centers, Medicare, retirement communities, all of it. That happens quickly. 50 years is like that. And it came out of nowhere. And so I think it is at least possible that something like that can happen again. And if we're going to create a country and a world that is worth getting old in, I think it's going to have to. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I'd love to just start us off, and again, there will be roving microphones, so anybody feel free to raise your hand. So much to talk about, and again, thank you. I want to kind of pick up from where you left off there at the end, that there is so much that is possible, and so much that I know so many ideas in this room of how we can make that possible. But I want to also set the stage, and a lot of the book is really nicely dealing with some of the paradoxes of how we as a country have engaged the question of old age and aging across the decades. And I just want to read something from the toward the very end, where you talk about how for some reason we have a different perception of now what we really can do in the next 50 years for one another. And I'll just read this little part. So you're talking about how we have this conception now of older people. And you say, in the era of older people, American political culture lost its ability to have meaningful conversations about old age. If a pandemic had killed hundreds of thousands of senior citizens in the 1960s, it would have led to an outcry and to legislative action in their name. In the COVID-19 era, this has not happened. So what accounts for that? Why is it that in those critical decades after World War II, we as a country were able to mobilize and engage and pass remarkable legislation, and yet now we're struggling to have some of these conversations and achieve liftoff in that way? What would you say?
Yeah, and I'll first sort of amplify one of the things you said at the beginning about COVID-19, something very serious that we all lived through. Sometimes when I talk about aging as a social problem, I mean, I don't even like to use that language. It's not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's wonderful that we get old. But as something that social policy will have to address. Sometimes it feels kind of like old-fashioned somehow, like it's something the government used to do, but now we should be worrying about AI and like I don't know what, all these other things. And that's misguided, I think, in so many ways, but one of them is that the disasters of the 21st century, if the last 20 years are any guide, what the 21st century will be about things like climate disasters, like hurricanes and heat waves, and pandemics, like COVID-19. And if you look at these two sets of disasters, who is bearing the brunt of the suffering? It is, in fact, statistically older people. If you look at who dies in Hurricane Katrina, for instance, I had the stat in the book, I can't remember, it's something like 60% of the deaths were people over the age of 70. And we don't think about Hurricane Katrina as a catastrophe for older people, but that's really what it was. And COVID-19 is the same way. And so for some reason, we have an inability to link the social kind of catastrophes of our time with the big social problem of aging. So the answer is why. In the book, I sort of say, there's a number of different answers, right? A question that large has to have a number of different answers, so I'll answer it from two ways. One is that I really think I'll say it this way. One thing that surprised me in the book, is that up till about the 1970s, between the 1920s and 1970s, older people are quite well organized into activist political organizations that are calling for serious systemic change around old age. I have a lot in the book about the Townsend movement, which you may have heard of. The Townsend movement it's like a totally forgotten civil rights movement from the 1930s, but it's a pension movement calling for huge pensions for anyone over the age of 60. I mean, it's kind of a crackpot scheme, but it had the support of millions of older people. It was one of the biggest social movements of the 20th century, totally forgotten. After World War II, you have older people organizing in lots of different ways. There's a National Council of Senior Citizens that is pushing for Medicare. There are even like more progressive activist organizations like the Grey Panthers, which you may have heard of, but also I talk in the book about kind of old age wings of Black Power. Like older people were pushing for and asking for these things in a way that I think in the last 50 or 60 years is much less common. And I think part of it does have to do with the kind of disintegration of old age as an identity category and as a category of need. You know, the energy from a group like the AARP has been to fight ageism. And that's great, it's an important thing. I mean, ageism is a real problem. But what it does is it says older people don't need help. They're great, they're just like younger people. They can do anything. And if that's the main lesson that the biggest organization is trying to push, it's hard to say we need vast new programs. So I think part of it is a sort of unintended consequence of a basically good or beneficial or understandable shift in the nature of old age identity. But that is against the context of something that, I mean, it's not just old age that we're unable to address in the ways that we should. It's lots of things. I mean, climate change is another thing that we are not addressing the way that we should. There are all kinds of social problems we are not addressing the way that we should. And so the general breakdown of trust in government and in public institutions and in each other that we have lived through in the last 30 or 40 years has consequences here too. Think about like, you know, something like education. The move is towards privatizing, it's towards homeschooling, it's towards vouchers, it's towards let's take care of these problems ourselves because we cannot trust public solutions. And I think the same thing is happening on the other end of the life course. And so, yeah, so I guess those would be my two answers.
Thank you. Questions? We'll have some microphones coming around. That's good. Thanks.
I don't think you can project onto the whole internet, which I think might be the point of the
Most of people in the room know that I have a very big mouth, so
Okay.
Prepare yourself. My name's Doris Geldman, and as many of the people in this room also know, I'm a local elder law attorney, so medicine is not my area, but I was very interested in some of your comments. I'm also a historian before I was a lawyer. And that has to do with how old people were taken care of before nursing homes were a thing. And that was, as you said, a very recent development historically, somewhere around 1940, before the Second World War. But there's a wonderful book, and if you haven't seen it or read it, I can't remember the author's name, but it's called One Day All of This Will Be Yours. And the book is all about how we took care of older people in those years pre-care homes. And the reality is we depended on the daughter. There was a daughter in the family who took care of mom and dad until the day they died on the farm. And as a result, the daughter, because she gave up getting married and she gave up having her own family, was given the family home. So that's how she was compensated for providing care all those years. Well, I can tell you that probably 8 or 9 times a week, I get a phone call from daughter or from mother wanting to know, how do I keep the nursing home from getting my house?
Yep.
And that is still the exchange. To this day, that is the house. But the one thing I wanted to also point out and perhaps ask your perspective on is the role of for-profit nursing homes, because despite what anybody else says, there is big, big money in in nursing homes, skilled care, and they'll tell you, oh, we never make any money, Medicaid doesn't pay us anything. It's not true.
Yeah.
There are venture capitalists making money hand over foot. So when we talk about the failure of government or the failure of society to do these things, I think that there might be a pull in the opposite direction that is driving the continued sort of very poor ghetto quality care that we're seeing in exchange for someone's house. That is profit-driven, greed-driven, actually, and I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll make one remark before I get to that, because the point you're making about how care was done in, like, you know, the good old days, which don't sound so good when you put them that way, but there's often a myth you might hear that, especially that you can see women telling themselves this myth in the 80s and 90s and probably up till today, which is like, well, in the old days, in the 19th century, in like the better times, people took care of their elders. The elders stayed in the house, they were taken care of by the family. This is a beautiful image. And it's not so much that that image is wrong. Of course that happened to some families. Of course there's also all kinds of elder abuse and things in the past too. But families today, and middle-aged women today, are doing more care than was ever done in the past. The amount of care has gone up, not down, for the simple demographic reason that there were not that many 85-year-olds around in 1850. So in 1900, most 50-year-olds, that's not that old, most 50-year-olds have no surviving parents. And so what we have now of a lot of 60-year-olds caring for their 90-year-old parents, that is extremely rare in the past. So we are really in new waters here, which is why something like the nursing home emerges. And she's completely right. I mean, the for-profit nursing home complex is, it's a catastrophe.
Can you say that again?
Which part?
About her being right.
Yeah, she was right. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like she has some kind of relationship with you that she wants me to be involved in. But she was right. And what's kind of depressing about this is it's not, and this has been one of the more depressing parts of this research in general, is that there are many things that we look at today and say, oh, why aren't there more geriatricians? Why is this underfunded and undervalued? Oh, why are for-profit nursing homes so lousy? People were saying all these same things in 1975. And in the 1970s especially, there are all these exposés about the terror of for-profit nursing homes. And little was done. And you might say, and the reason probably is as simple as she's saying, it is large money. And also to actually regulate these things is really hard, because what happens is, you know, I'll talk about the Golden Girls. You might remember why Sophia lives with her daughter in the Golden Girls, because her retirement home had burnt down. This is actually pretty common. They're very poorly regulated. There's a lot of fires. And what happens is regulators will come and say, you need to shut down. You're not up to code. And they'll say, okay, fine. Where are these people going to go? And there's no good answer to that question. And so they get all these waivers to like stay open forever. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that it's not a novel insight that money matters in American politics, but the nursing home industry is big money, and that has affected the long-term care options available to us here.
You talk about how policy choices that we've made, I like referring to these as choices, have led us to a certain state. The us we're talking about here is the United States of America, maybe 5% of the world population. Other choices are being made elsewhere.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the consequences of those choices and what we might be able to learn from that?
Yeah. So the question is about sort of putting this in a global context. I will say, and I said this earlier today when talking to some people at lunch, I am trained as and began life as a European historian, and I expected that I would be able to write one of these books where the conclusion, one of these kind of annoying books where the conclusion says, oh, let's look at Denmark and they have all the answers. And it turned out I couldn't do that. It's true that in like Europe, for instance, there are some things that I think we could learn from. They have, for instance, more equitable pension schemes. Like, for instance, Social Security, when Social Security was passed, the actual experts, and all the experts were from Europe because that's where these pension programs were first developed. They all thought Social Security was a nightmare because it's so complicated, as you might know. Like, you know, when I was, 21, I got my first paycheck. It was like, what is this thing? What is this amount? I'm never going to get this back. It's so complicated. And that's not true of European pension systems. So there are some ways in which we have a lot to learn from them, and also things like assisted living facilities are much more seen as public utilities than they are here. But the other thing I'll say is that especially to solve the problem of the old or the fourth age, the one that really is bedeviling America right now, it's an extremely hard problem to solve. It isn't like Social Security, I mean, it's complicated, but on the other hand, it's kind of simple. Because if you're 67 and you're retired and healthy, yeah, give me a few $100s a month, that's really gonna help out. If you are a disabled, widowed, older woman living in an apartment building in New York, what do you need? I mean, it's a list a mile long. It's much harder. And I kind of thought, well, I'll research what they do in Britain or France or Germany or whatever and say, oh, we ought to do what they're doing. But I actually found that for this problem, other countries are in as much of a mess as we are. They might be handling it differently, and for instance, things like caregiver supports, tax breaks, some kind of income benefits for people doing long-term care, but there is no utopian society for this particular issue, in a way that surprised even me a little bit. The other thing I'd say is that we actually have learned a lot. There actually has been a lot of global exchange around this already, sometimes in the wrong way, because what's happening in Europe now is the expansion of for-profit nursing home chains. And the other thing, but like some things that we do have here, like assisted living facilities, are based on a European model. That one is based on a Dutch model. Hospice comes from an English model. And actually the kind of day hospital or daycare movement is also an English example. And so we actually have been learning already, but I wish there was a place we could look to and say, let's do what they did. Control C, Control V. But fortunately, it's not that simple.
Thank you. I don't think it's fair to ask a historian to solve our problems moving forward, but if you could wave a wand and change one thing over the next 10, 20 years that you think would make a difference, what would that be?
It would be the unionizing and improving labor standards for home healthcare workers. Because, there's some in the room tonight. So because, you know, you see these things like, oh, it's the biggest growth industry of the 21st century or whatever. Yes, of course, because this population is exploding, the need is vast. Why are we investing so little in this space? Why are we giving this job to people who it's $15 an hour or whatever? Incredible turnover. I mean, it's a mess of a system that we've created. Because, you know, I think I would urge a paradigm shift. The fact that so many people are living to 85 or 95 is not a problem, it's a success of American public health policy. And so we should see it as a success, and we should say, yes, these people deserve dignity, and they cannot get it when they're cared for in this way. So imagine a world where these are well-regulated, well-paying jobs that people stay in for 30 years, and there's some actual social respect that goes to them, which would follow money, to go back to the earlier case. I mean, you can't morally respect your way out of this problem. They'll be respected once they're paid. And I think that like living at home is gonna remain the dominant option for most people. And so to make that humane is gonna require a better use of that workforce. And so that to me is like, it's not a silver bullet, it's not gonna solve everything, but it would solve a lot of things, including underemployment amongst especially non-college educated middle-aged people. I mean, it could be a great career opportunity. So if I look ahead to like a humane America in 2080, that's a big part of it.
For those of us that work in this space every day, what advice do you have for us for the new administration that's coming in?
That's the question that's unfair to ask historians. But I mean, actually, I have so little to say about this that I think I would have asked to elevate your voice and hear you say, what do you see as because like I'm aware of all the challenges that will be faced in many different spheres, but in this sector, what do you see as the challenge that you'll see in the next 4 years?
Well, we have to overhaul our entire retirement system. When Social Security was set up, it was set up for people who only lived to about age 60.
Yeah.
And you got a benefit at 62 if you overlived your life expectancy.
Yeah.
How many people in this room are over 62? Okay?
No.
So we have a retirement system that needs to be fixed. And we can do that. The state of Washington has imposed a payroll tax. And they were sued about it a couple years ago, but it did go forward. At this point, you have to pay the payroll tax if you don't own your own long-term care insurance. And you can't get out once you get in. But it only pays for 3 months worth of care.
I see, yeah.
That's not a very realistic amount of care for most people.
Yeah.
And so 12 other states are looking at imposing a payroll tax for long-term care.
Yeah.
Because Medicaid is administered by the states.
Yeah.
It's funded by the federal government, but administered by the states. And so in the arena that I work in, I'm seeing more work to get the states to be more involved.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to get a federal solution
Yes,
here.
I know what you
But a federal solution is to overhaul the Social Security Medicare to
Yeah.
make it more in line with the life expectancies that
Sure.
people now have.
Yeah.
It's so out of date, it's ridiculous.
I know. So
I
yeah,
hold
Social Security
seminars here too, so that's why.
Okay, so
So-
Social Security has not been meaningfully, I looked it up to be sure, it has not been meaningfully reformed in my lifetime.
Right.
So there were some, the raising of the retirement age and a few tweaks that Reagan did happened like a month before I was born.
Right.
But a lot has changed in the last 41 years. And I think my response to that is, the other thing that's kind of depressing about especially Social Security is that to resolve the problem is not that hard.
No.
It's like, I could imagine more conservative solutions where you might say, let's raise the retirement age to 69, or more liberal ones that say like, oh, let's raise the tax rates. And probably I can imagine lots of compromises, and the bills are written, but it would just require Congress to act like an adult for 1 minute.
Cooperation's all it requires.
Yeah, and it's-
The system is sound. It's the fact that we've borrowed all
Exactly.
this money.
Yeah,
The system is not running out of money. That's
Right.
a lie that we hear every year. The
Yeah.
system is fine. It's that we're taking that money and using it elsewhere.
Yes, exactly.
That
So,
was promised to us as our retirement. So with the new administration coming in and the movement to privatization of a
Yeah.
lot of our services, there's great concern
I know.
for our Social Security, our Medicare,
Yeah.
other social programs that will likely be on the chopping
Yes,
block.
I
So
know,
I
it
just
is-
wondered if you had any wisdom for us who already see what's coming.
I wish I did. I now we just saw that Dr. Oz is in charge of all of this now. And
Right, right. I'm really comfortable about that,
Yes,
too.
I know. So I
I'm
guess a
sure
couple things I
Oprah
would say.
is really happy about giving him a platform at this point.
Okay, here's something positive I can say. I can say that two popular presidents, have expended a lot of political capital trying to privatize Social Security.
Right.
Ronald Reagan did it in the early 80s, and George W. Bush did it in 2003. And you might remember, all the political capital that Bush got after 9/11, he torched it trying to privatize Social Security. And it failed both times. It remains a popular program. Do I think that the political will is there to save and improve it as we need? No. But do I think the political will is there to cut it? Not really. The other thing I would say is, and this is a little bit more of a dismal thing, is something I did find in researching the book is that there have been a lot of really cool state-level experiments since the 1970s, and I talk about some of them in the book. They've been hard to replicate. They've been I talk about one in particular, which maybe some of you in the room have heard of, called ONLOC, which is in California. It's basically in Chinatown. It's for an immigrant population. It's an amazing program. It was so complicated to set up because it's Medicare funds, it's Medicaid funds. They had to go to Congress. It was so complicated. So these state-level programs, as cool as they are, have been really hard to scale. And so one thing we will see in this decade is states doing neat things, and they should, but I don't think we're going to find solutions at the state level.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And to some extent. The program for all-inclusive care of the elderly, which is connected to that, is a similar challenge where those of you in Charlottesville may be aware we have a program for all-inclusive care of the elderly in Charlottesville, but there's one for a very large community, right? So the ability to scale that, extremely difficult. Yes.
So, yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you for doing this research. I think it's something that's very needed. My name is Phyllis Kachiras. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'd like to have you say some more about your optimism, because I specialize in seeing couples, and the pressures on couples now to deal with their aging parents is just terrible. And it's breaking down the couple, and it's, you know, especially in some other cultures where they feel like their first responsibility is to take care of the parent. The stress on the couple is just, you know, unreal.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of some optimistic things that I can give to them and myself to be able to foresee what we can do that will make this work.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so I think, what do I say? Okay,
Well,
you're saying you're working with like middle-aged couples that are having a lot of stress as they deal about their, yes, I know, being in one of them. So, what do I think? I guess what I'd say is, I don't know. I mean, there are moments when I'm optimistic and moments when I'm not. Hearing all of your questions is not putting me in a great mood. But I will say that from the sometimes being a historian can be useful. From the long view, things are not as bad as they've been. When I looked at the situation for sort of, let's say, impoverished people of color in North Carolina in the 1930s, I mean, what do you think that's like? These are people living in like dirt rooms. They have nothing. Care for people with disabilities. I mean, they have nothing. So even though things are very challenging right now, they are in many ways much better than they were 100 years ago. Now that's no comfort to an actual person, and probably they would be annoyed to hear that. But as a historian, I sometimes comfort myself with that. Let me say something else. I want to say something else to comfort you, but I can't think of anything. I mean, the other thing I'd say is, I do think, I think that, so Social Security, for instance, I think there's a lot of innovation happening in interesting ways, especially around things like housing, to deal with problems like these that I think are going to be, I think things like intergenerational living are going to become more common in the next 10 or 20 years. They already are becoming more common, but I think that they're kind of looked down upon. I think it's going to look like an actual solution to people's care needs and the high cost of housing, and not seem like a burden to everyone. So I think there will be experiments like that. And like my back to the wall, I think the government will get it together to save Social Security and Medicare, because they're like the most popular programs in the country, and so many people rely on them, and so many voters rely on them. So I don't think things will get worse, and I think things have been worse, and I think there will be interesting solutions in the private sector and from the government in the next 10 years, I think. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I just, I see my 95-year-old father every day. I'm in my 70s. He's in assisted living. It is exorbitant, thousands of dollars a month. The money's running out. I mean, it's just, he can't live in my house because his electronic wheelchair won't work there. And, I don't see hope. And not only do I not see hope for when I'm in my 90s potentially, his father lived to be 105, so it could happen. My kids live far away, and I just don't know what help. I can't afford assisted living. Maybe intergenerational living will be the solution of one of many, but who's going to pay for that? I mean, where my father lives, it's such a niche group of relatively rich people that can afford thousands of dollars a month.
Yeah.
I mean, what about the rest of us? There's no way we can afford assisted living.
I know.
What's going to happen to us that are in our 70s? I don't think about this on a daily basis, or I'd get very depressed. Plus, I'm too busy caring for my 95-year-old dad.
Of course.
But it's just unbelievable to think about.
Yeah.
If I can't go into assisted living, then I won't have kids to help me. They're in California, and they have jobs, and I don't know. It's very depressing to me. That's all I'm going to say.
I know, yes. I think you're giving voice. I saw many people nodding as you were speaking. What can I say? I mean, my answer before when I was trying to find optimism, I was lying to try to help that person who seems so nice. But yes, it's terrible. And your anger is valid, and I wish I had something better to tell you, but I don't. And the other thing is the story about, like I said, everyone knew in the 70s that nursing homes were awful. Stories like the one you're telling, one source I looked at where women's magazines from the 80s, like if you page through Ladies' Home Journal from the late 80s, I don't know what you expect to find, but what you do find are all these stories like the one you just shared about caregiving and the horrible challenges of caregiving, the financial stresses, the emotional stresses. And so these are known problems, and it is quite depressing 40 years later that we are hearing the same thing. So I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. I mean, I try to be an optimistic person, probably because the whole world, including now you all, are trying to get me to be pessimistic. But I see where you're coming from. I feel that way too.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and end on an optimistic note. And first of all, thank you so much. But to build off of some comments that you have said several times, both in your remarks and in our conversation here, to close us out, we have done incredible things before.
Yes.
We have done incredible things quite commonly in this country and faced tremendous challenges. As a physician, I would also say we do incredible things every day. We replace hips with prostheses, which no one would have thought about many decades ago, right? Those are extremely expensive things. Mm-hmm. We can figure out caregiving. There are amazing human beings trying to work on that every day.
Yes.
And so that's my note of optimism as we close. Thank you again. As we always say with Medical Center Hour, these are beginnings of conversations. We have to close up, unfortunately. But please continue these conversations with your communities, your constituencies, your families, your friends, including now, if there's some food left, continue to enjoy and have conversation. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And there are books in the back for signing and purchasing.